Dr. George Archibald, along with Ronald Sowie, a colleague from Cornell, established the International Crane Foundation, also known as the ICF, in the spring of 1973 as the World Center for the Study and Preservation of Cranes. He received his undergraduate degree from Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia in 1968, and completed his PhD at Cornell University in 1977. For 27 years, Dr. Archibald served as the president of ICF. Today, he continues to be employed full-time by ICF, with his current programs involving work in Afghanistan, Azerbaijan, Bhutan, Cuba, China, India, Iran, North Korea, Pakistan, South Korea, and Russia. In recognition for his accomplishments, Dr. Archibald has received 4 honorary doctorates and many awards, including the Gold Medal from the World Wildlife Fund, a Fellows Award from the MacArthur Foundation, the Wildlife Conservation Medal from the Zoological Society of San Diego, among many, many others. And with that, please enjoy the presentation.
Thank you very much, George, and thank you all for coming tonight. It's a great pleasure to be speaking back in the Midwest. I've been traveling a great deal, and there are many friends in the audience tonight, and I'm just thrilled to see you. Especially former members of our board, Paul Healy up here, Rick Fox over here, Tom Donnelly, and who else? Bobby Asher, and well, Leslie's here, great. And Larry Benjamin back there, thank you all. And how many are members of the Crane Foundation that are here tonight? Thank you very much for your support. Tonight, I'm dedicating my talk to Paul Healy, who has done so much for the cranes, and especially in North Korea. In 2005, he and I convened a meeting in Beijing, and here are the North Koreans and the South Koreans together talking about a new way to cook food on a solar stove. And we discussed what we can do to help the cranes in North Korea. So starting in 2010, for 6 years, he and I traveled back and forth to North Korea. We knew we had to help the local people. The cranes all left North Korea during the 1990s when there were such chronic food shortages because they no longer had free fertilizers from the Soviet Union. And we would return to South Korea after being in North Korea and share the information because, of course, there's a complete information block between North and South Korea. So the Crane Foundation has sort of been a go-between, and we're very happy to report that our target site, which is the Pisan Cooperative Farm, a former wintering area for the cranes, we helped the farmers develop organic farming, which was the first time for North Korea. Following the example of Cuba, they had the same problem after the Soviet Union fell apart in 1990. So thank you all very much for your many contributions. The International Crane Foundation would not exist were it not for this man, Aldo Leopold, and his famous book, A Sand County Almanac. This is his shack along the Wisconsin River, just 4 miles from the headquarters of the Crane Foundation. And I discovered this book at Cornell University and was absolutely mesmerized by the beauty of one essay called The Marshland Elegy, in which he expressed his feelings about cranes that I felt but couldn't bring to words. And if you go to the shack today and you walk out behind it, you'll find this Leopold bench looking out over the river. And on a rock, it says, "It is here that we seek and still find our meat from God." Aldo Leopold. Well, I was just finishing at Cornell. I was planning to work for the New York Zoological Society, and my first assignment was in Japan. And I overheard a conversation. "I'm Ron Sowie from Barbaroo, Wisconsin. I'd never met someone from Wisconsin. I knew where Wisconsin was, and I knew quite a bit about it because I just enjoyed this Sam County Almanac, which is all about Wisconsin in the 1930s and 40s, a very difficult time for the environment. And I introduced myself and I said, do you know about all the Leopold? He said, do I know about him? It's my favorite bird watching spot. It's only 10 miles from my home in Barbaroo. And that was the start of a friendship that led to the creation of the International Crane Foundation, because we only met for a few days at Cornell before I was off to Japan, and he was just starting his graduate studies. I'm a Christian, and I love this quote: "The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands." I think Leopold felt the same way. He wrote, "The crane is the symbol of our untamable past, of that incredible sweep of millennia which underlies and conditions the daily affairs of birds and of men. When we hear his call, we hear no mere bird. He is the trumpet in the orchestra of evolution." The sadness discernible in some marshes arises perhaps from their once having harbored cranes. Now they stand humble, adrift in history. Those are words of Aldo Leopold. And here's Ron and myself when we were young. We started the Crane Foundation on his dad's farm in near Barbaroo. And after 10 years, we were able to buy land and build the current campus of the Crane Foundation. Unfortunately, Ron passed away in 1987 from a stroke, but we continued. Cranes have a fascination because of their size, their remarkable calls and displays. And it was that interest that led me to study the differences in the behavior, the language of all the different species of cranes. And I put together this evolutionary tree of the cranes. You'll see the sandhill cranes standing sort of in the middle, and it's an ancestral group, an ancestor to two groups that have sprouted up to whooping cranes standing in the very top there. You'll see that most of the cranes are sort of a gray color, except the whooping crane and the two cranes standing beside it. That's the red-crowned crane and the white and black-necked crane. And the one standing sort of to the right of the sandhill, that's the Siberian crane. Now, all of those white cranes are the most critically endangered. So tonight, I'm going to tell you the story about those three species of cranes. As I mentioned, cranes have a unique appeal. And I know many of you see sandhill cranes around Lake Forest. And they have a lot of personality, don't they? And they make their presence known. Well, what cranes require are huge expanses of grassland. And because many of them are migratory, it requires cooperation among many different countries. Cranes fascinated the early residents of the Midwest, and we must pay tribute to these people on whose land we now stand. The Crane clan up at Lake Superior were the leaders of the Chippewa groups. They put together this painting, and they went to Washington and presented it to the president. In 1849, the president didn't meet with them. They spent many weeks there hoping that he would. What they were saying is, we are connected mentally in our minds and from our hearts, and we all wish to express that we hope the land around Lake Superior will be set aside for our people as represented by these species of wildlife. Well, here we have the sandhill crane today, and they are unique among cranes in that they paint their entire bodies with mud in the spring. When they arrive back from Florida, they're a light gray, but soon they turn reddish color. And here you can see them picking up mud and painting it on their feathers. The iron in the mud oxidizes and chemically links with the feathers, and it can't be washed out. They look sort of a mess for a while, but soon they're a gorgeous brown color and very difficult to see when they're sitting on their nests with their head down. Sandhill cranes are also successful because they can fly throughout the year, whereas the white cranes all lose their flight feathers for 6 weeks and they are completely flightless. So this bird can always escape from predators. Sandhill cranes can breed in small wetlands like you have around Lake County, and they can hide away in the reeds, very, very difficult to see. In contrast, the white cranes require huge wetlands. And being white, they can be seen by each other and are an effective territorial threat to other cranes flying over as these bright white lights shine out from the marsh, saying this is protected real estate. Cranes are fascinating because they dance, because they are carnivores at some point of the year. They feed their young live animal food, and birds like the whooping crane featured here even depend on live animal food in the winter. And it's because these cranes that require the huge wetlands and that are more dependent on animal food that they are a great challenge for conservation. One pair of whooping cranes in the winter defends about 500 acres of salt marsh in order to produce enough blue crabs to feed their chicks through the winter and to survive to the next breeding season. Most of the cranes have areas of bare red skin on their head, which they can expand and contract voluntarily and instantly. These two whooping cranes have their red expanded because they're about to mate. And this is how they do it on stilts. Well, that beautiful white bird was found over this colored area, which are the Great Plains of North America. The blue areas are where they used to winter, and there were thousands of them. But when Europeans plowed into Indiana and Illinois, Iowa, and Minnesota, and up into Saskatchewan and Alberta, these people had to live off the land and they killed most of the animals. So today we just have this one group of whooping cranes. Only one flock was left back in the 1930s, and just 15 individuals migrating from an area north of the Great Plains and wintering in Texas. So this bird came that close to extinction. Imagine you are with your family in one of these covered wagons heading out over western Illinois, and there are no stores. And you have a bunch of potatoes, which you're hoping you can plant and get enough food to get you through the next winter, because that would be pretty much all they had to eat. So the wildlife were absolutely decimated across our Great Plains. There were elk, there were antelope, there were bison by the thousands, there were trumpeter swans. Even the Canada geese and the white-tailed deer disappeared. And so did the whooping cranes. The juveniles have this mottled plumage so they can hide very well from predators, just like sandhill cranes are painting themselves The young cranes, young whooping cranes, are also that color. So it was directly because of humans and hunting that destroyed our cranes. And today we have the same thing happening in the Middle East. And I'll tell you later in my program about how we're starting a new program in the Middle East where there's absolute carnage of wild demoiselle cranes and Eurasian cranes. So the cranes have slowly increased, and today we may have as many as 600 birds or 550, somewhere in there. We're not quite sure of the exact number, but they're slowly increasing. This is where they breed, Wood Buffalo National Park, a huge area set aside because of the wood buffalo or wood bison. Although the bison were wiped out on the prairies, there was a distinct subspecies survived way up here in the far north, which is larger and darker than those on the Great Plains. And this is where those last whooping cranes nest. Their nesting area was not discovered until 1954. Unfortunately, it was in a protected area. They migrate in small groups and they end up in Texas, where we have a crisis today because they're in the coastal wetlands and the ocean's level is increasing. And soon these wetlands will be too deep for the whooping cranes. So we have an office in Rockport, Texas, and we're working on the conservation of areas to which the wetlands can expand inland on protected ranch land. And of course, the battle is against development, housing development, and so on. So we have a new population of whooping cranes in Wisconsin that migrates down to Florida. And that population starts at our headquarters. This is, in this photograph, most of the land on the far side of the road is the property of the International Crane Foundation. And this is Crane City, where we maintain whooping cranes, and we breed them in captivity and provide birds to establish new populations in the wild. The whooping crane is much larger than the sandhill crane. Now, I'm going to tell you about an experiment that was done in the 1970s and 80s by the government. This was before we were really involved with the whooping crane. They took 289 whooping crane eggs from Canada. They lay 2 eggs, but usually only rear 1 chick, so there were extra eggs. And they put them in the nests of sandhill cranes out in Idaho. And from those, 84 whooping cranes fledged that were raised by sandhill cranes. But not a single little whooping crane raised by the sandhill cranes wanted to pair with whooping cranes when they grew up. They were sexually imprinted on sandhill cranes. Now, I want you to remember that because at the end of my talk, I'm going to come back to this experiment. Sometimes we have the whooping cranes raise their own chicks, and then we release these birds into the wild. Other birds are raised by costumed people. You want to volunteer? And these are properly imprinted because the puppet is just like the head and neck of a whooping crane. And whooping cranes stay with their parents about 9 months. So these birds want to stay with the costumed person. And now we have a costume pilot leading them through the organization called Operation Migration. They come down from Canada every year between 2001 and 2015 to lead a bunch of cranes to Florida. The red-crowned crane is much larger than the whooping crane. It will weigh up to 25 pounds. Today, they're found in northern Japan, a different subspecies from those that are migratory on mainland Asia. They are absolutely spectacular in every way. Whereas the whooping crane has black outer wing feathers, the red-crowned crane has black inner feathers that are used in display. This is their dance. All cranes dance, but the red-crowned cranes have the fanciest dances. And they use those black feathers in these incredible bows, turning the red of their head against it during their display. Sometimes they rear 2 chicks, but they require huge expanses of wetland. This is up in Japan. And the former range covered much of northern China into Mongolia. But after the Korean War, the Chinese soldiers were sent to northern China to drain the wetlands. They did what the settlers did in central parts of North America to the whooping crane's habitat. And 95% of the wetlands disappeared. Although the crane is a sacred bird, at that point in history, that didn't matter. They wanted to turn northern China into the great northern food basket. Throughout the Orient, the red-crowned crane is a symbol of long life and good luck. And this is a wedding kimono, because of course we all need a lot of luck in that department. The Japanese population was totally extirpated, so they believe, from the Japanese archipelago after Japan opened to the West in the late 1800s, what we call the Meiji Restoration. The feudal laws that protected cranes was abolished, and the local people, because there were huge flocks of cranes doing a lot of crop damage, decimated them. In 1924, they found 24 cranes in a remote area of Hokkaido, the most northern island, and they started to feed them after the Second World War. And they increased to today, there are about 1,800 red-crowned cranes. At the feeding station, hundreds of photographers gather, and every time a crane does something, there's a loud sound of clicking. I think they're the most cherished and photographed cranes that are alive. That's the good story from up in northeastern Japan. On the mainland, things have been much more difficult. As you see, the cranes have disappeared from most areas of northern China and are only found in a few spots. And most of them, we believe, are in Russia, just across the border where you see those marked areas. And there are 2 migration routes, one to China, about 500 birds, and one to the Korean Peninsula, about 2,300 birds. But so total, we have about 4,000 red-crowned cranes today. And since 1973, I have been involved in Korea. This is the Korean demilitarized zone outlined by the white line that's about 2.5 to 3 miles wide, stretching right across the peninsula. Now, most of Korea is mountainous. We just passed over the city of Seoul, 22 million people, right beside the DMZ. And these rivers are coming out from North Korea. And in the central highlands, we have this huge basin where the heaviest fighting occurred during the Korean War. This is called the Chorwan Basin. That's where most of the cranes are wintering. As we continue east, we get into even higher mountains, areas where cranes could never survive until we get to the west coast. That's North Korea on the left and South Korea on the right. That big plain in the central highlands called the Chorwan Plain used to be a great civilization. Korea had 3 kingdoms, and one of them had their headquarters on that plain. But the country was consolidated eventually, and today it's covered by rice fields. In the spring, they flood the rice field and they plant their crops, they harvest them, In the autumn and in the winter, it looks like this. No one is allowed into this zone for the building of residential areas. It's called the civilian controlled zone. And it's several miles wide, south of the DMZ. That's the DMZ, the dark area to the north that's mostly forested. So the migratory birds arrive, the fields have been harvested, there's a lot of waste grain out there, and it becomes an excellent wintering area for the cranes. But now the big threat is greenhouses are being built out on the Chorwan Plain. And in some areas to the south of here, entire valleys are covered by greenhouses in winter, where they can grow vegetables and flowers to sell in the cities. So we have this type of development going on, and we're trying to conserve the land because we have 10,000 white-naped cranes. The total species is about 12,000. So 10,000 of them are there. And we have these red-crowned cranes, and that's Chorwan, the green area. And that black line is the demilitarized zone. Another big threat we have now is avian flu. Imagine, in Israel 2 years ago in the winter, 8,000 cranes dropped dead from avian flu. Last winter in Romania, 30,000 cranes died of the Eurasian crane, sort of the counterpart to the sandhill crane in Romania. And here we have, say, 10,000 white-naped cranes, 90% of the species. If that happened in the DMZ, we could lose practically the whole species. Well, if you follow the line north, you'll see the city of Wonsan. That's in North Korea. And just south of Wonsan is a huge plain called the Anbion Plain. That's what it looks like. The photographer is facing south. Over those mountains is the Chorwan Basin, about 40 kilometers away, but much further away politically. This one Pisan cooperative farm has almost 3,000 people living there, divided into 13 different working groups, from propaganda teaching to primary school care, to medicine, to growing rice. Nearby, there's a pavilion built between 735 and 742 called the Crane Pavilion. It's a national treasure of Korea, of course. And the aristocrats used to come to this beautiful building and look out over the marsh. It was all a big marshland, and hundreds of cranes would be there in the winter. And they called it the Crane Pavilion. There were actually two of these, but one was destroyed during the Korean War. Well, there are no aristocrats today in North Korea, except in the capital. And the people out there that Hall and I discovered were dirt poor. They had few machines. They were working as people have worked in Korea, I suppose, for hundreds of years on the very edge. Then something very, very terrible happened in North Korea during the 1990s. As I mentioned, the Soviet Union no longer was able to provide fertilizer after 1990. And the new Russia didn't give anything to North Korea. Even the Russians had a hard time to survive themselves during the 1990s. And several million people, and a lot of them children, starved to death in North Korea during that time. Of course, the military and the aristocrats, the administration, had the food, and the other people starved, and they never asked the rest of the world for help. Of course, they were so close, the rest of the world really didn't know what was going on there. The cranes disappeared from the plain, the Anbion Plain. All that was left was a monument that this is a very special place where our beautiful cranes winter. And the people continued to try to survive on soils that were becoming increasingly depleted. So Hall and I were able to bring literature about organic farming, and our North Korean colleagues wrote a cookbook for organic farming that might apply to North Korea. And we were able to support a bunch of North Koreans to go to China to see effective organic farming. They were able to buy tons and tons of this nitrogen-fixing vetch, which you plant in the fields in October after the harvest. It starts to grow, it freezes, and then in the spring will continue to grow, and it's about 2 to 3 feet high by the time they plow it under in mid-June to plant the rice. They have to plant the rice quite late because of the frost. And so this has been able to bring nutrients into the soil. We were also able to bring thousands of fruit trees from China as seedlings to plant on the deforested hills and so on. And it was very rewarding to see prosperity come to this farm. The government was very impressed by this organic farming that we were developing at North Korea on the Pisan Cooperative Farm. They built a piggery and they built a classroom in which they could teach people from other parts of North Korea about farming. But then something terrible happened. We were working with the Academy of Sciences, and word got to people in the Ministry of Environment that we were working with the Academy of Sciences, and jealousy came, and the people at the Academy of Sciences were no longer able to even go to that valley, and the Environment Ministry took over the project. We were able to get a pair of red-crowned cranes from China to serve as decoys to the wild birds, and when we were no longer able to go to North Korea, we had reports that the cranes were coming back. So at the same time, on the Chorwan Basin in South Korea, we're trying to do something to save this land, because if relationships improve between North and South Korea, this area is dedicated as reunification city. So speculators have bought most of the land, and they lease it out to the farmers, but should it be turned into reunification city, this land is going for several $100,000s an acre. So that's what we'd have to pay to save it today. So that shows you the type of challenges in our work. That's why I'm a Christian. So we continue the battle on the Korean Peninsula, and I want to thank Hall for all the work that you've done helping us there. So we've covered 2 of the white species. Now the species that the Crane Foundation has worked the most on, and is perhaps the most challenging, the Siberian crane, which is very, very different from the other cranes. They have a flute-like voice, not the harsh voice like you've heard. And this bird was found in 3 different flyways, breeding up in northern Russia, migrating to Iran, and to India, and to China. But when we started the Crane Foundation, we only knew about the birds wintering in India. China was closed behind the bamboo curtain. The birds in Iran were believed gone. So Ron Sawi did his doctoral work on the Siberian cranes that wintered in India. They have the longest beak of any crane, and it's used to dig in the mud for tubers of plants. And this is the saving grace. Unlike the whooping crane that defends these huge territories to support animal life that it eats, the Siberian crane in winter is predominantly a vegetarian. And there'll be tons of tubers of sedges in a muddy wetland, and that will support hundreds of cranes through the winter. So you think they should have it made, but we consider this the most critically of all the cranes because what has happened. They have very complicated behaviors. This is their unison call or their duet that sounds like a European police car. And on and on. And they're slow breeders like the whooping cranes. They seldom raise a couple of chicks and they have to migrate over the mountains to get to India. So lots of challenges. Ron Sawi did his research at the end of that migration route in northern India in a place called Rajasthan. And in the spring, he followed the cranes and went up to Afghanistan and found this beautiful wetland called Lake Abhyastada, where the cranes were resting before they continued on to the breeding grounds in Russia. He also discovered that people were hunting them in Afghanistan. Yeah. So let's go to India. Not far from the Taj Mahal is one of the greatest bird sanctuaries in Asia. It's called Kyodaldeo National Park. And this is the flock of Siberian cranes. When Ron started his study, there were about 80 of them. And when he completed his study, there were about 56. Every winter, there were fewer birds. They were called the lily of birds in India. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi would go down to see them when they arrived. It was in the newspapers. And unfortunately, they were all killed. And we put radios on them in Russia, satellite radios, and found that Afghanistan was the problem. They were simply being shot and not getting to India. So we lost the central population of birds. In 1978, our Iranian colleagues found a flock of 12 Siberian cranes wintering in a wetland along the Caspian Sea. And they were wintering in a duck trapping area where thousands of waterfowl were trapped, not shot. And because the central area was an area where they wanted a lot of ducks to gather, the Siberian cranes were safe there. Well, we were so concerned about the Siberian cranes that we had international meetings to talk about how we all had to work together. Robert Bateman did this beautiful painting of a Siberian crane. We had thousands of posters made with slogans in 14 different languages and sent these posters all over the place. But we failed to save the cranes. We lost the birds that went to India, and we lost the birds that went to Iran. Now, the Iranian birds suffered from the Soviet Union's loss too. There were food shortages throughout the former republics, especially Azerbaijan, just north of Iran, where the Siberian cranes stopped. And the government allowed hunting in the nature reserves to try to provide enough food for the people. And the birds were wiped out. This one Siberian crane kept coming to Iran for 16 years. And this past winter, he never showed up. So I can say that 2023 was the end of the Western flock of Siberian cranes. So we did all this work in Western Siberia and we failed. So at the same time, we became very, very close to our Russian colleagues because they were seeing the demise of the birds on their breeding grounds. And the breeding ground is way up on the tundra where the Russians estimated they had 300 or 400 cranes feeding on these enormous spreads of tundra filled with birds, spectacled eiders, king eiders, geese, swans, and Siberian cranes. They paint the base of their neck with mud as a sexual display before they dance and copulate in the morning. But if it rains, it will wash out, unlike the sandhill cranes. So here's a pair at their nest. They have 2 eggs, but like the whooping cranes, they only raise a single chick. Out on the marshes, the Russian bandit, many birds, hoping that the Chinese would be able to find these Siberian cranes. But during 1966 to 1976, China was in the throes of the Cultural Revolution, and we had absolutely no information from China. So China's closed, the other populations are declining. So Dr. Vladimir Flint, wearing the red hat, and I became great friends and decided to approach our respective governments to do an egg lift and to bring some eggs to Barbaroo, Wisconsin, to establish a group in captivity. Siberian cranes had never bred in captivity. There were very few birds in captivity. Ron carried this group of eggs back from Moscow, high technology, hot water bottles, a suitcase on his lap, and this little chick hatched over Cleveland. Yeah, we called it Aeroflot. And Dr. Flint came to Baraboo in 1977 and 78. And we were able to get 3 pairs of Siberian cranes raised from eggs imported from Russia. So it was big news. And because Dr. Flint was approaching his officials and I was approaching Fish and Wildlife Service, and then these officials would get together under the terms of the Environment Agreement that Brezhnev and Nixon signed in 1972. These eggs made it 10,000 miles through all this bureaucracy. And I'll never forget the story of Ron telling me, him carrying his suitcase back. Frank Sinatra was going on a concert tour to Europe, and in an airport in Gander, north of Newfoundland, Ron ran into Frank Sinatra at the airport. Can you imagine that? In this case with the eggs hatching and so on. Lots of stories connected to this. And the lady on the left, Elizabeth Zimmerman, did her master's thesis from Cornell University, explaining about all the meetings and all the red tape involved in this program. And Ron Sowie had a stack of papers that thick of permits to show at the borders in Russia and in the United States. And in both cases, they said, oh, we can't be bothered looking at all those papers. That took us years to get it. You know, it could have been a stack of magazines. So we got, and in 1981, we had the first Siberian crane hatch in captivity in the world from an egg laid in captivity. And we did it by putting lights over their pens to simulate the land of the midnight sun, the long photo period up in northern Russia. And it turns out the Siberian cranes are very easy to breed in captivity if you give them what they need. But we didn't know where they wintered in China. And China has 8 species of cranes. Of course, China was crazy during the Cultural Revolution. And we started work in China in 1989. And I brought a big stack of photographs, 8x10 photographs of the Siberian cranes in India, photographs that Ron took. And they sent those photographs all over the country to their colleagues. And finally, they discovered several hundred Siberian cranes at a big lake in southern China. And the local people were hunting them and hunting every other bird that flew and selling them for meat. So then we discovered Poyang Lake, the largest lake in China, which fills with water from the monsoons in the summer and drains out in the winter, creating a great mosaic of mudflats, winter lakes, and a smorgasbord for the greatest concentration of water birds in Asia. The government protected the area. This is what China looked like back in the 1980s. It's changed. We were able to put satellite radios on them and follow the cranes. These birds have been poisoned. The farmers would put out grain to catch ducks and geese, and sometimes the cranes would eat them. Hunting was a problem in some areas, but the Chinese were on top of it. And crane by crane, just as with the whooping cranes, the cranes started to increase. Now, I told you that they are vegetarians during migration and in winter. And these birds are digging out tubers. You'd never see a flock of whooping cranes together like that. And we worked with the Chinese government to manage the water levels, to produce the maximum number of tubers. And I'm very happy to report that we have now more than 6,000 Siberian cranes in our eastern population. And the big threat now is that the provincial government wants to build a dam across the outflow to keep high water in the lake throughout the year, which will be the end of birds. So we are working on that one, but we have to be very careful because things are not so cool with China these days. And, you know, this could go south very easily. But you'll notice the numbers on that map. The breeding grounds of the India group was not discovered until 1981. The breeding grounds of the Iranian birds, 1996. The Iranian birds were discovered in 78. The India birds were discovered in the 60s. The wintering ground in China in 1981. And in the 1980s, the Russians did their first work on the breeding grounds in the Northeast. So all this is very recent. All this is very recent. All these huge losses are very recent. All these gains are very recent, emphasizing how important it is for us to continue our work. Now I'm going to introduce you to two wonderful people. This is Wally Modicek. He was my top colleague in Afghanistan. I worked there from 2002 to 2006, working on public education in remote areas. We were hoping for a bright future in Afghanistan. But when kidnappings became rampant, he was no longer able to go in the field. I no longer went to Afghanistan. And when the government fell in August of 2021, my wife and I decided we would support Wally and his family. He has 6 daughters and 2 sons to come to United States. And I'm happy to report that they're now all living in Barbaroo, Wisconsin. And this is one of my most remarkable colleagues. Her name is Dr. Elena Ilyashenko. And although things have been very, very difficult in Russia, this Dr. Flint, who sent us the eggs, became a hero in Russia. And he established this crane working group of Eurasia. And she has continued. Dr. Flint has passed away. And she has continued that work and working with colleagues from the United Arab Emirates, putting satellite devices on hundreds of cranes of various species and learning more about their migration route. So I want you to keep Wally, who's now in Barbaroo, and Elena, who's still in Russia, in your mind, because I'm going to explain to you my latest dream, which even Kate hasn't heard about yet. So here's the migration route, and we know exactly that migration route because of satellite radios attached to the cranes. Now, remember the sandhill crane and the whooping crane story? Sandhill cranes raised all these whooping cranes, but they didn't whoop it up with the right color. And we developed a technique called costumery, and that was all done at the Crane Foundation. And we developed the technique of flying with cranes, right? So here we are in Russia. We helped the Russians establish a captive breeding center for Siberian cranes. And this is not so far from Moscow at the Oka State Nature Reserve. They can breed many Siberian cranes. And they developed techniques for flying with Siberian cranes using hang gliders and ultralights. But guess what? It's too dangerous to fly south of the border. But we have somebody who flies south of the border that is still pretty abundant. This is the Eurasian crane. And one group of them flies to India. You see those lines going to India over Afghanistan and Pakistan? That's where Wally is from, Afghanistan. And now he is working with Elena and myself to establish a Middle East crane working group. And our first project is now underway in Pakistan because they're also killing cranes there, so I'll show you later. And Elena is continuing to work with our colleagues in Saudi Arabia, and they're providing more satellite radios to put onto the cranes. So those bold arrows, that's the former migration route of the Siberian crane. So my idea now, which I want to present to the Russians, I've just put this together recently, is at the top of the black line, you see those Eurasian cranes go to India. If we take captive produced Siberian crane eggs and put them into their nests, they're going to raise the Siberian cranes and bring them to India. But they're going to be imprinted on Eurasian cranes. They won't be good for breeding. But through them, Wally and our other colleagues can preach the gospel to the local people in Pakistan and Afghanistan about protecting Siberian cranes. And if one gets shot, it's no great loss because the bird's already screwed up. But we're hoping during the next, say, 3 or 4 or 5 years to really have what happened in the United States through Aldo Leopold, a reformation in values about conservation. We were killing hell out of everything as the colonists came into our country. And that's what's happening now in Afghanistan and Pakistan and some other Mideastern countries. So we have to do this conservation work, right? And if we can use the Siberian cranes that are sort of imprinted in Eurasian cranes, that will be a big plus in our public education. But here's the clincher. The Russians would love to fly from the breeding ground, the yellow arrow, south to the border with Kazakhstan with a flock of Siberian cranes that are all imprinted through using the costume on the right species. Then we would take each bird and release it with a single Siberian crane that's imprinted on Eurasian cranes. And that little Siberian crane would go, oh, a Siberian crane, and would follow that other bird and end up in India. Because we've done this with the whooping cranes. It works. And then the GPS for that little crane is not for at the end of the black line, it's for at the top of the yellow line. They would go back to the original breeding grounds, but then they would come back to India. So do we have our work cut out for us or not? This is all an idea. And there we hope the Siberian crane can be restored in West Asia. So we have lots of dreams. And one of my dreams is going to India and talk to a very rich Maharaja to say, wouldn't it be great to get these birds back? Because it's going to take a lot of money. That's on my wish list too. So the black-necked crane. This is the indicator of climate change because they breed at very, very high altitudes. Now, if the temperature changes slightly in Florida, it's a little bit warmer than it was before. Well, Florida continues. But if it changes up in the Tibetan Plateau, it's the difference between ice and water, which is just a huge difference and is affecting the black-necked crane population. Now, most of these birds are found on top of the world, the Tibetan Plateau in China, but that plateau edges into India, into Nepal, and into Bhutan. So just now, ICF this past month had a big meeting in Barbaroo of colleagues from those nations, and we developed a proposal to work together for the next 3 years in studying what's happening to the black-necked cranes. This is our exhibit of black-necked cranes at the Crane Foundation with the mural in the background. And you can come up and see them and all the other cranes of the world at our exhibits. This is in Tibet. The local people protect the black-necked crane, just like the red-crowned crane is a sacred bird in the Orient. The black-necked crane is up there. And they nest in wetlands or in these little islands. The female is on the nest. The male has just come back to begin his incubation duties. Well, what's happening in this particular wetland? This is called Lake Coconor, way up in the huge lake. Because the glaciers are melting so quickly, and precipitation is increasing on the Tibetan Plateau, the level came up and most of the crane nests were flooded out. But the Chinese colleagues and Tibetan people up there were very innovative. And in the off season, they built the nesting area up with the shovel. So they were able to get them up above the floodwaters. And here they are raising their young. So we have the melting of the glaciers, but a lot of these wetlands are sitting on what we call permafrost. And when it melts, the wetland simply disappears. So we are monitoring these populations throughout their range as a reflection of what's happening with climate change. And sometimes it's difficult to count them because the sheep will be in with them. Can you see the sheep there in that photograph? They gather in big flocks. When we started our work in the early 1990s, we estimated there were about 7,000 black-necked cranes, but they've increased to about 16,000. And this is because there are now wetlands in areas where there never were wetlands because the glaciers are melting. And the advantage is we have this wonderful relationship between the Tibetan people and the black-necked cranes. The wintering area in Tibet is along a river. It's just at 12,000 feet. Then they migrate up to these high altitude plateaus, 15,000 to 17,000 feet to breed. But the Tibetans do not want their plants, do not want to plant their crop in the spring until the cranes start to migrate. Because when they migrate, they circle and circle and gain altitude and then head north. And the Tibetans believe that the cranes are blessing their fields. So they dress up the yaks. They have a little shrine that lady is holding. And the grandparents are dropping food into the furrow. And that's the first planting of the wheat in the spring, and with the blessing of the black-necked cranes. Now you'll see an arrow coming into Bhutan. A group of black-necked cranes fly, get this, at 28,000 feet to cross the Himalayas, way above the peaks, to come to Bhutan. And in Bhutan, they're also treasured birds, and you can see Bhutan is this little paradise on the south slope of the Himalayas, where 71% of the land is covered by virgin forests, with tigers and 3 species of leopards and so on. But the cranes are found in the agricultural areas, the open areas where they can feed on waste grain in the fields. This is a roosting area of the black-necked cranes, and early in the morning. When we started our work there in 1996, there were about 300 black-necked cranes, but they doubled, and now we have some pairs bringing 2 chicks down, and the population is up to about 600, which is all great news. So the Bhutanese have a crane festival every year on the king's birthday. They dress like black-necked cranes, have a great time. A big cultural event. Crane is a very important part of their culture. So if you'd like to join me, I'm taking a group to Bhutan in December of this year. And I'm bringing a group to Mongolia in June of this year, if you'd like to join me to see the world's greatest expanse of temperate wetland, grasslands. Remember I told you our grasslands have been devastated by agricultural development and everything else. But in Mongolia, vast areas like we used to see here in the Midwest still exist. And in them, we have 5 different species of cranes, particularly this white-naped crane, which is very rare. I'd also like to invite you to visit us at the Crane Foundation and pick up our literature outside, where we have a little 120 acres of restored prairie and some virgin prairie, and you can meet the whooping cranes and all the other cranes and learn how they live, how they migrate. Our CEO is Dr. Rich Belfus. He started as he's from Chicago, and he started as an intern in 1986. And stayed with our organization. I turned over my job as CEO in the year 2000, and since then have dedicated my life to some projects, to raising money and to encouraging the next generation, and it's worked out beautifully. Rich has done most of his work in Africa. I haven't talked about Africa today, but they have absolutely gorgeous cranes. This is the wattled crane, the crowned crane. They require huge wetlands, much like the whooping crane. This is the national bird of South Africa, beautiful blue cranes. And the population of Africa is expected to double by the year 2050. So I think we have many more challenges in Africa than we actually do in Asia today, because we've made a great deal of progress in Asia, except in the Middle East, where we're going to be concentrating with Wally and Elena, but here in Africa. Aldo Leopold said, our ability to perceive quality in nature begins as in art with the pretty. It expands through successive stages of the beautiful to values as yet uncaptured by language. The quality of cranes lies perhaps in this higher gamut, as yet beyond the reach of words.
Speak to the current status of the eastern population of the whooping crane?
The eastern population of the whooping crane numbers about 75 birds. Last year, we had 23 nesting pairs in Wisconsin, and I think 18 chicks hatched, and only 3 of them fledged. And we have a very high mortality of whooping crane chicks and of sandhill crane chicks from predators. We don't know who the predators are because we don't actually see the event out in the marsh. But we believe they're either coyotes or raccoons. And so the population is not sustainable unless we can overcome this problem with predators. You cannot remove the predators because if you remove the coyotes, for example, these are territorial animals, then more coyotes will flood into the area that's unoccupied and your mortality will increase. So one of the ways we're thinking of improving survival is mowing a path from the area where they roost at night in the wetland up to the fields where they forage during the day, more upland area. If it's more open and they can see better, maybe they'll keep their chicks out in the open and not get nailed by these predators and can sneak up through the grass. We have a second population of about 85 birds in Louisiana, and they're doing a little bit better, but we still have problems there, not with we have fairly good survival, but we have a lot of embryonic mortality, and we don't know if it's because of the hotter weather. The whooping crane may not be as adapted to high temperatures during incubation, but we're working on that problem too. So our experimental populations are not successful yet, but we're continuing to work on it. We don't give up easily. Yes.
This is a funny question, but I keep thinking, where do you actually live? I mean, you must, or you keep saying we, and I'm thinking, gosh, you must have a lot of people over there in Asia.
We have 125 people on our staff now.
You do.
And we are registered. We have offices in 6 countries.
Oh, my.
And yeah, we have a lot of bills to pay. And I travel quite a bit. In 2019, I traveled 200 days, but I don't want to do that again. And in the year 2026, I turn 80. So next year, after a meeting in South Korea in January, I'm planning not to travel at all out of North America. I can come down to Chicago and New York and whatever. And I'm writing another book. By the way, is my book out there, Kate?
No, but it's in our gift shop.
Okay. Sorry. Yes, sir.
Have you considered turtles as the predator?
Snapping turtle. Yeah.
They grab them under the water.
Right. Fortunately, the cranes don't swim in deep water. Usually they may go across a ditch or something, but the chance of a turtle getting them are pretty small. Whereas trumpeter swans or Canada geese that are out, and ducks out in the deeper water, snapping turtles will come up and grab them by the feet and eat them. But we haven't had any problem with the cranes as far as we know.
Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Legally, how would it work with the right? Because I know that's very protected.
Our colleagues in North Korea sent an invitation to their embassy in Beijing that they would like to invite us to come to North Korea. And Hall very graciously and carefully checked with our State Department and Treasury Department that it was okay for us to go there and to bring in money to help them. So we were able to go. And after 2016, regulations changed. We had the Ministry of Environment take over the project, which was very disappointing to us, but we also couldn't go to North Korea anymore because of deteriorating relations, then COVID came and North Korea is completely closed, but maybe we can go back, hey, Paul, one of these days, we hope. Yes,
Question? Yeah, how long do cranes live?
yeah, I'm doing a webinar next week that you're welcome to join. And I was preparing it and I remembered a story when I was talking to the hunters in Pakistan. Now, unfortunately, they're shooting cranes because ever since the Russians invaded Afghanistan in 1979, there's just been a proliferation of firearms throughout Pakistan and Afghanistan. And lots of cranes are being shot. So I went there in the early 2000s, as I told you, and I went to Pakistan as well. And we met with a group of these people that keep cranes in captivity as pets and that also hunt them. And I had some beautiful, those Robert Bateman posters, I had a couple of them with me, of the Siberian crane. And I said, I'd like to give a prize to the person that has the oldest Eurasian crane and the oldest demoiselle crane. These are the two species that still migrate through there. So I said, put your hand up if you have a crane older than such and such. Older than 10 years, everybody has their hand up. Over 20 years, most people. Over 30 years, a lot of people. Over 40 years, a few people. This is Eurasian crane. And we get up to 51 years old, so that's the oldest one. But actually, from scientific research on banded birds, they live to be about 20 to 25 years if they're lucky. But these birds are in captivity, so of course they have health care. And but the funniest one was I went to the demoiselle crane, and demoiselle crane is much smaller. And I said, I kept going, 50s, so there's several people, 60s, a few people, 70s, one little old man. So I said, okay, would you come up and tell us a story about your crane that's over 70 years old? And he says, yes, she's such a nice bird. She said, she became blind when she was 63, but she knew every place to go, and she would know where to get water, and she would know where to feed and where to sleep at night. And I loved her more than my wife. Yeah, Gene.
George, remind me how many varieties of cranes you have up in Barbaroo? And is that all of them?
Yeah, there are 15 species and we have them all in Baraboo. Yeah.
2 by 2?
Hopefully. Yeah, we've raised all of them, but you know, we don't raise many of most species because we don't have programs to put them back into the wild because they have substantial numbers in the wild and there's no reason to do that. And zoos can only hold so many cranes, and we don't want them to be overcrowded or give them to private breeders who might not take good care of them. So we don't raise that many of most species.
Speaking of zoos, the Brookfield Zoo is now redoing an exhibit to have 2 cranes. It'll be open in June.
Whooping cranes? No.
One of them is very down great.
Okay, Don?
George, isn't it true that there are cranes everywhere except South America? And why is that?
We don't know why they are not in South America. They've never been, but they're everywhere else except Antarctica.
Any final questions? Yes, last one, John. when is the best time to come see your campus? And then is there a best time to see cranes in the wild in Baraboo?
We open from the 1st of May until the end of October. You can see all 15 species of cranes there then. And we have a pair of whooping cranes breeding in the wild very near Baraboo that I can show you. And so if you pick up our literature and give me a call, I can show you sandhill cranes and whooping cranes in the wild. Of course, you have sandhill cranes all around this part of Illinois. So you've seen them, yeah.
Dr. Archibald, thank you.
You're welcome.